Margaret Hale stood in her burning barn with a rifle in her hands and a choice that would define the rest of her life. The flames reflected in her eyes, not fear, but fury. At 55, she'd already buried one man she loved. Now Victor Caldwell wanted to bury her legacy in ash and bone, but the stranger who'd arrived 3 weeks ago wasn't running, and neither was she. This is the story of a widow who refused to surrender, a drifter who found his last stand, and the land that demanded blood before it offered belonging. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The wind over Wind Hollow Ridge didn't whisper. It screamed. Margaret Hale had learned that distinction in the 6 months since she'd put her husband Thomas in the ground. Standing at the fence line now, her weathered hands gripping the split rail that needed replacing, she felt the October gale tear through her coat like it was searching for the parts of her that hadn't yet turned to stone. 55 years old. A widow. A rancher trying to hold together 300 acres of high desert scrubland with nothing but stubbornness and spite. The cattle were scattered across the eastern pasture, dark shapes against the rust-colored earth. 42 head now, down from 60 when Thomas was alive. She'd sold 18 just to pay the banknote. The fence line sagged in a dozen places. The barn roof leaked, the windmill stuttered and groaned like an old man's chest. And every week, someone in town asked her the same question with that particular blend of concern and condescension that made her want to spit. "How much longer you think you can manage out here alone, Margaret?" She tightened her grip on the fence rail until her knuckles went white. "As long as it takes," she muttered to the wind. The ranch house sat a quarter-mile back from where she stood, a low-slung structure of weathered timber and river stone that Thomas had built with his own hands 40 years ago. Smoke should have been rising from the chimney by now. She should have been inside starting supper. But lately, the silence of that house pressed against her chest like a physical weight. She'd taken to staying outside until full dark, finding excuses. Checking fence lines that didn't need checking, counting cattle she'd already counted. Anything to delay the moment when she'd have to walk through that door and face the empty chair at the table. Margaret turned back toward the house, her boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground. The sun was dropping fast now, painting the ridge in shades of copper and blood. In another hour, it would be cold enough to see her breath. She was halfway to the porch when she saw them. 2 riders, cutting across the southern boundary where her land met the open range. Margaret stopped, her hand instinctively moving to the rifle she'd propped against the porch rail that morning. Out here, unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. She waited, standing perfectly still, as the riders drew closer. The lead horse was a big roan gelding, moving with the steady gait of an animal that had covered serious ground. The rider sat easy in the saddle, a man, broad-shouldered, wearing a long coat that had seen better days. Behind him, riding double, was something Margaret hadn't expected. A child. The man reined in 20 feet from the porch. He didn't dismount right away. Smart. Margaret's hand was already on the rifle. "Evening, ma'am," he called out. His voice was low, rough around the edges like a man who didn't waste words. "Name's Daniel Mercer. This here's my daughter, Eliza." Margaret said nothing. She lifted the rifle just enough that the barrel caught the last of the daylight. The man didn't flinch. He just sat there, hands visible on the saddle horn, waiting. The little girl, she couldn't have been more than 7, pressed her face against his back, peering out with wide, dark eyes. "I'm looking for work," Daniel said. "Heard in town you might need a rancher." "You heard wrong," Margaret said flatly. "Did I?" He gestured toward the sagging fence line, the listing windmill, the barn with its damaged roof. "Respectfully, ma'am, I don't think I did." Margaret's jaw tightened. "I didn't ask for your assessment of my property." "No, ma'am, you didn't." He paused, then added quietly, "But I'm asking you to consider it anyway." The wind gusted between them, carrying the smell of sage and distant rain. The child shivered, and Margaret saw that her coat was too thin for high desert autumn. Something in her chest twisted. "Why here?" she demanded. "Why my place?" Daniel met her eyes. Even in the fading light, she could see they were gray, the color of winter sky. "Because I need work, and because your land looks like it needs someone who knows what he's doing." Awful confident. "Experienced," he corrected. 20 years running cattle, 5 years before that breaking horses in Montana. And the child? His expression didn't change, but something flickered behind those gray eyes. Her mother passed, 2 years back. It's just us now. Margaret understood that kind of arithmetic, the cold equations of loss. She lowered the rifle a fraction. Not much, just enough. I don't need charity, she said, and I don't need some drifter who'll work 2 weeks and disappear when the weather turns. I'm not offering charity, Daniel said evenly. I'm offering my labor. You pay me fair wages, I work hard. That's the bargain. Fair wages? Margaret almost laughed. Mister, I can barely pay my banknote. Fair wages aren't in my budget. Then pay me what you can. He glanced at his daughter, then back to Margaret. Room and board, and whatever's left after you settle your debts. I'm not particular. Margaret studied him. She'd seen enough men in her life to recognize the type. This one wasn't soft. The lines around his eyes spoke of squinting into hard sun. His hands, even from 20 feet away, looked calloused and capable. He sat his saddle like a man who'd been born on horseback. But she'd also learned that desperation made men dangerous. You running from something? She asked bluntly. No, ma'am. You wanted by the law? No, ma'am. You drink? Not to excess. Margaret's eyes narrowed. What's excess mean to you? Means I've never hit a bottle before the day's work was done. And I've never hit anyone who didn't need hitting. The child shifted behind him, and Margaret saw her knuckles were white where she gripped her father's coat. 2 weeks, Margaret heard herself say. The words came out before she'd fully decided to speak them. Trial period. You prove yourself useful. Maybe we talk about something longer. You prove yourself useless, or worse, trouble, and you're gone. Those are the terms. Daniel nodded slowly. That's fair. There's a bunkhouse behind the barn. It's not much, but it's got a stove and a decent roof. You'll take your meals with me in the house. I don't cook fancy, but I cook enough. We're obliged, ma'am. Mrs. Hale, Margaret corrected. Or Margaret, if you're going to be working my land, but not ma'am, makes me feel old. The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. Yes, Mrs. Hale. He dismounted then, moving with the stiff care of a man who'd been in the saddle too long. The child slid down after him, her legs wobbly. Daniel steadied her with one hand, his other reaching for the roan's reins. Put your horse in the barn for tonight, Margaret said. There's hay in the loft and grain in the bin by the door. Help yourself to what you need. Bunkhouse keys hanging on a nail just inside the barn entrance. Appreciated. Margaret turned toward the house, then paused. Supper's in an hour. I'm making stew. There'll be enough for 3. She didn't wait for his response, just walked up the porch steps and through the door, closing it firmly behind her. Inside, she leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. What the hell are you doing, Margaret? She had no answer, just the certain knowledge that when she'd seen that child shivering in the cold, something older than pride or caution had made the decision for her. The sound of hoofbeats crossing the yard reached her through the walls. Then the creak of the barn door, the low murmur of a man's voice talking to his horse. Margaret pushed off the wall and walked to her kitchen. The pot of stew she'd started that morning sat on the stove, barely touched. She'd been cooking for one so long, she'd forgotten how to measure portions for more. She added more potatoes, more carrots, more water to stretch it. Then she set 3 bowls on the table instead of 1. The house felt different already, less empty, less haunted. She didn't know yet if that was good or dangerous. An hour later, there was a knock at the door. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and opened it. Daniel stood on the porch with his daughter beside him. He'd cleaned up some, washed the trail dust from his face, slicked back his dark hair. The child had done the same, though her dress was still travel-stained and patched. Come in, Margaret said. They entered quietly, the child's eyes going wide as she took in the small house. It wasn't much, just a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area at the back, and 2 bedrooms off to the side. But it was warm, and the lamplight was soft, and the smell of stew filled the air. Sit, Margaret instructed, gesturing to the table. Daniel helped his daughter into a chair, then took one himself. Margaret ladled stew into bowls and set them down with thick slices of bread she'd baked 2 days ago. For a few minutes, no one spoke. They just ate. Margaret watched the child, Eliza, Attack her food with the single-minded intensity of someone who'd been truly hungry. Daniel ate more slowly, but steadily, his eyes never quite settling in one place. A man used to watching his surroundings, Margaret thought. A man who'd learned to stay alert. "How old are you, Eliza?" Margaret asked finally. The girl looked up, a bit of carrot stuck to her chin. "7, ma'am." "Mrs. Hale?" Margaret corrected gently. "And you don't need to call me that either. Margaret's fine." Eliza nodded solemnly. "Yes, Mrs. Margaret." "Close enough." "You been traveling long?" Margaret asked, directing the question at Daniel. 3 months, he said. "Started in Kansas, worked our way west." "Kansas?" Margaret broke off a piece of bread. "That where you're from?" "Grew up there. Worked cattle ranches mostly. Spent some time in Dodge City." He paused, then added, "I served as a deputy there for a while." Margaret's hand stilled. "Law work?" "Yes, ma'am." "Margaret." He met her eyes. 5 years wearing a badge. But that was before. Before your wife passed. Yes. She heard the finality in his voice. The door closing on that part of his life. She understood that too. Some chapters ended hard enough that you couldn't bear to read them again. "Why'd you leave the law?" she asked anyway. Daniel set down his spoon. "Because I learned there's some things a badge can't protect you from, and some losses that make you stop believing in justice." The raw honesty of it silenced her. She looked at Eliza, who was focused on sopping up gravy with her bread, apparently used to her father's dark truths. "I'm sorry," Margaret said quietly. "So am I." They finished eating in silence. When the bowls were empty, Margaret cleared the table while Daniel helped Eliza wash up at the basin. The girl's eyes were drooping by the time she dried her hands. "She's exhausted," Margaret observed. "It's been a long day." Daniel looked at his daughter with something fierce and tender in his expression. "Long few months, truth be told. There's a spare room," Margaret heard herself say. "Just a bed and a dresser, but it's warmer than the bunkhouse. Child shouldn't be sleeping in an unheated shed if she doesn't have to." Daniel's jaw tightened. "We're not charity cases." "Didn't say you were." Margaret crossed her arms. "But if you're working for me, I need you rested and functional. Can't have that if you're up half the night keeping a fire going in that bunkhouse stove. Eliza sleeps in the spare room. You take the bunkhouse. That's practical, not charity." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just be ready to work come dawn." "I will be." Margaret showed Eliza to the spare room, Thomas's old office, converted after he'd stopped needing a desk. The bed was narrow but clean. She'd washed the sheets just last week, some optimistic part of her still maintaining the house like guests might arrive. Eliza climbed into bed fully dressed, too tired to change. Margaret pulled the quilt up to her chin. "Sleep well, child," she said. "Thank you, Mrs. Margaret," Eliza mumbled, already half asleep. Margaret turned down the lamp and left the door cracked open. When she returned to the main room, Daniel was standing by the fire, staring into the flames. "She'll be fine," Margaret said. "I know." But his shoulders remained tense. "This thing you're running from." "I told you I'm not running." "Whatever it is," Margaret continued firmly, "I don't need to know the details, but I need to know it won't follow you here. I've got enough trouble without inheriting someone else's." Daniel turned to face her. In the firelight, his features looked carved from stone. "I'm not running from the law. I'm not running from debt. I'm not running from violence I started." He paused. "I'm running from a life that ended when my wife died, trying to build something new before Eliza forgets what it feels like to have a home." The honesty of it, the stripped-down truth, hit Margaret harder than she expected. "All right," she said after a moment. "All right." He nodded and moved toward the door. "I'll see you at dawn." 5 o'clock. I'll have coffee on." "Yes, ma'am." He left, and Margaret was alone again. But this time the silence didn't press quite so hard. She banked the fire, checked the locks, and went to her bedroom. Through the thin walls, she could hear Eliza's soft breathing from the spare room. Margaret lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what the hell she'd just done. Hired a stranger, invited his child into her home, opened a door she'd kept firmly closed for 6 months. But when she finally drifted towards sleep, it wasn't fear that followed her into dreams. It was something that almost felt like hope. Dawn came cold and sharp. Margaret was up before the sun, stoking the fire and putting coffee on to boil. She'd slept better than she had in weeks. No nightmares, no waking at 3 in the morning to the sound of Thomas's absence. By the time pale light touched the windows, she had biscuits in the oven and bacon sizzling in the pan. The knock came at 5 o'clock exactly. Daniel stepped in, bringing the smell of cold air and hay with him. "Morning. Coffee's on the table, breakfast in 10 minutes. He poured himself a cup and stood by the fire, warming his hands. Margaret noticed he'd changed into work clothes, canvas pants, a worn flannel shirt, boots that had seen serious labor. "What needs doing first?" he asked. "Fence line on the eastern pasture. Needs mending in at least 6 places that I know of, probably more that I haven't found yet. After that, the windmill's been running rough. Might need greasing, might need new parts." "I'll take a look." Eliza emerged from the spare room, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Margaret dished up breakfast: bacon, biscuits, gravy made from the drippings. The girl ate with more restraint than last night, but still with obvious hunger. "You know anything about chickens?" Margaret asked her. Eliza shook her head. "Well, you're about to learn. I've got 24 laying hens out back. They need feeding and watering every morning. Think you can handle that?" The girl's face brightened. "Yes, ma'am, Margaret." "Good. After breakfast, I'll show you how." They ate quickly, and then the day began in earnest. Margaret took Eliza out to the chicken coop, showed her how to scatter feed, and check the water troughs. The girl was tentative at first, nervous around the birds, but she learned fast. By the time they'd collected eggs, Eliza was smiling. "They're funny," she said, watching the hens peck and strut. "They're simple," Margaret corrected. "Give them food and water. They'll give you eggs. That's a fair trade." They returned to the house with a basket of eggs, and Margaret sent Eliza to sweep the porch while she started on laundry. Through the window, she could see Daniel out in the eastern pasture, already working on the fence. He moved with efficiency. No wasted motion. He'd pull out the old wire, hammer in a new post, string fresh line. By noon, he'd repaired 3 sections. Margaret made lunch, cold ham sandwiches and pickles. She rang the dinner bell, and Daniel came in, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold. "Fence is worse than you thought," he said. "Needs a full rebuild on the southeast corner. Posts are rotted through." "How long?" 3 days if I push, 5 if I'm careful." "Be careful," Margaret said. "I need it done right, not done fast." He nodded and ate his sandwich standing up, too restless to sit. That afternoon, Margaret worked in the house while keeping one eye on Eliza, who'd discovered the barn cats and was trying to befriend them with bits of ham. Daniel disappeared into the windmill housing, and soon she heard the screech of metal being disassembled. By evening, he'd fixed the windmill and started on the fence rebuild. At supper, he reported his findings. "You're low on fence posts, going to need at least 30 more to finish the job right, and the wire you've got is old stock, keeps breaking when I try to tension it." Margaret did the math in her head. Posts and wire would cost money she didn't have. "I'll make it work with what's there," she said. "It won't hold through winter." "It'll hold long enough." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Just nodded and went back to his food. After supper, he returned to the bunkhouse, and Margaret helped Eliza get ready for bed. The girl was already more comfortable in the house, moving through the rooms with less hesitation. "Do you like it here?" Margaret asked as she tucked her in. Eliza nodded. "It's warm, and the chickens are nice." "They're just chickens." "But there are chickens," Eliza said seriously. "Papa says when you take care of something, it becomes yours." Margaret smoothed the girl's hair back from her forehead. "Your papa's a smart man." "He's the smartest man in the whole world," Eliza said with absolute conviction. Margaret smiled. "Get some sleep." She turned down the lamp and left the child to her dreams. The days fell into rhythm. Daniel worked from dawn to dusk, repairing what 6 months of neglect had damaged. The fence line straightened. The barn roof got patched. The cattle got sorted and counted properly for the first time since Thomas died. Eliza shadowed Margaret through morning chores, learning to feed chickens, gather eggs, tend the vegetable garden before winter killed it completely. The girl was quiet but observant, absorbing lessons like a sponge. And Margaret found herself talking more than she had in months. She told Eliza about the ranch, how Thomas had built it from nothing, how they'd weathered droughts and hard winters, how the land demanded everything but gave back just enough to keep you fighting. She didn't talk about Thomas himself. That door remained closed, but she felt it opening, just a crack. On the fourth day, Margaret rode out to check on Daniel's progress. She found him digging post holes in the southeast corner, his shirt stuck to his back with sweat despite the October chill. "You're working too hard," she observed. He straightened, leaning on the post hole digger. "Work needs doing. It'll still need doing tomorrow. You don't have to kill yourself over it." "I'm not." He wiped his forehead with his sleeve. "But I'm also not going to stretch a 3-day job into 3 weeks just to look busy." Margaret dismounted and walked the fence line, inspecting his work. The posts were plumb, the wire was tight, the corners were braced properly. "You know what you're doing," she admitted. "I told you I did. A lot of men tell me things. Fewer deliver." Daniel hammered another post into the ground. "I'm not most men." "No," Margaret said quietly, watching him work. "I'm starting to see that." That evening, she paid him his first week's wages. It wasn't much, $20 scraped from the household money. But Daniel took it with a nod and tucked it into his shirt pocket without counting. "Fair trade," he said. The second week began with colder weather. Frost came early, whitening the ground by dawn. Margaret woke to find Daniel had already started the fire in the main house, saving her the trouble. "Didn't need to do that," she said when he came in for breakfast. "Fire needs starting. You were asleep. Seemed logical." "Still, that's not part of your job." He looked at her evenly. "Maybe I'm expanding my job description." Something in his tone made her pulse quicken. She turned away, busying herself with the coffee pot. "Suit yourself," she muttered, but she didn't tell him to stop. On the 9th day, everything changed. Margaret was in town, picking up supplies. The general store was crowded, ranchers stocking up before winter set in hard. She was comparing prices on lamp oil when she felt someone watching her. She turned to find Robert Caldwell leaning against the counter. He was a lean man in his 30s, dressed too fine for ranch work. Pressed shirt, polished boots, a silver watch chain glinting at his vest. His smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Mrs. Hale," he drawled. "Heard you hired some help." Margaret's spine straightened. "News travels fast. In a town this size, always does." He pushed off the counter, moving closer. "Curious choice, bringing in a stranger, especially a drifter with a kid in tow." "My hiring decisions aren't your concern, Robert." "Maybe not, but my father's interests are." His smile sharpened. "And you know he's still interested in that water access across your south boundary." Victor Caldwell, land baron, cattle tycoon, and the man who'd been trying to buy Margaret's ranch for 5 years. Thomas had refused every offer. So had Margaret. The water access Robert mentioned was the creek that ran through her southern pasture, the only reliable water source for miles that didn't freeze solid in winter. Victor Caldwell wanted it badly enough to make offers that weren't quite threats. Yet. "The answer's still no," Margaret said firmly. "Same as it was last month. Same as it'll be next month." Robert's expression didn't change, but something cold moved behind his eyes. "My father's a patient man, Mrs. Hale, but patience has limits." "So does my tolerance for this conversation." Margaret picked up her supplies. "Now, if you'll excuse me," she brushed past him, but his voice followed her. "That drifter you hired? Might want to ask him what he's running from. Man doesn't take a job that pays in room and board unless he's desperate or hiding." Margaret didn't respond, just walked out of the store and loaded her supplies into the wagon with hands that trembled slightly. She drove back to the ranch faster than was wise, the horses sensing her agitation. When she arrived, Daniel was in the barn, shoeing one of the work horses. He looked up as she pulled in. "Everything all right?" he asked, reading her expression. "Fine," Margaret lied. But that night, as she lay in bed, Robert Caldwell's words circled through her mind. "What are you running from?" She realized she'd never actually asked Daniel the full truth, just accepted his abbreviated version, widower, former lawman, looking for work. But men didn't cross 3 states on horseback with a 7-year-old child unless they were running from something or towards something. The question was which. Toot. The 10th day brought the first real test. Margaret woke to the sound of cattle bawling in distress. She was out of bed and pulling on boots before she was fully conscious, rifle in hand by pure instinct. Outside, chaos. Her herd was scattered across the yard, spooked and running in panicked circles. In the pre-dawn darkness, she could barely see what had frightened them. Then she caught the flicker of torchlight near the barn. Fire. She ran, screaming for Daniel. He burst out of the bunkhouse half-dressed, took one look at the situation, and sprinted toward the barn. The fire was small, just a pile of hay near the barn door, burning fast and hungry. But in another minute, it would reach the structure itself. Daniel grabbed a bucket, filled it at the trough, and threw water on the flames. Margaret did the same. They worked in frantic tandem, bucket after bucket, until the fire was nothing but smoking ash and charred hay. Margaret stood in the smoke, breathing hard, her nightgown soaked and filthy. "Who did this?" Daniel's voice was low and dangerous. "I don't know," Margaret lied, but she did know, or suspected strongly enough that it amounted to the same thing. Victor Caldwell. Or more likely, men working for Victor Caldwell, delivering a message. Sell, or else. Daniel crouched beside the remains of the fire, examining the ground. "Multiple riders," he said, pointing to hoofprints. 3, maybe 4. Came in from the south, set the fire, rode out fast. "How do you know that?" He looked up at her, and in the gray dawn light she saw the lawman he used to be. "Because I spent 5 years tracking men who did things like this." Margaret's hands tightened on her rifle. "It's a warning." Warning about what? She told him then, about Victor Caldwell's offers, about the water access, about Robert's veiled threats in town. Daniel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he stood slowly. "You should have told me," he said quietly. "Why? So you could leave? This isn't your fight." "I work for you. That makes it my fight." "For 2 weeks," Margaret shot back. 2 weeks at $20. That doesn't buy you getting burned out because of my problems. Daniel stepped closer. In the growing light, she could see the hard set of his jaw, the steel in his gray eyes. "I've got a daughter sleeping in your house," he said. "That alone makes this my problem, but more than that—" He paused, then continued with fierce certainty. "I've spent 2 years drifting from one temporary job to another, never staying long enough to matter, never letting Eliza put down roots because I was too goddamn broken to build anything permanent." He gestured at the ranch, the land, the house where his daughter slept safe and warm. "This is the first place in 2 years that's felt like it could be more than temporary. And I'll be damned if I let some land baron burn it down before I've even figured out if it could be home." Margaret stared at him, her heart beating too fast. "You don't owe me that," she said hoarsely. "No," Daniel agreed, "but maybe I owe it to myself." The moment stretched between them, charged with something Margaret hadn't felt in a long time, something that scared her almost as much as the fire had. She broke the silence first. "We should check on Eliza, make sure the noise didn't frighten her." They returned to the house together. Eliza was still asleep, undisturbed by the commotion outside. Margaret made coffee while Daniel changed into dry clothes. When he returned to the kitchen, she poured 2 cups, and they sat at the table in silence, watching the sun rise through the window. "They'll come back," Margaret said finally. "Probably. Could get worse than fire." "Probably," Daniel said again. Then he looked at her. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Margaret wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, feeling the warmth seep into her cold fingers. "Fight," she said simply. "Thomas built this ranch from nothing. I'll be damned if I let it go to Victor Caldwell for a fraction of what it's worth." "Even if it costs you everything?" She met his eyes. "I've already lost everything once. I survived. I'll survive again if I have to." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then we fight." "We. I told you, I'm done drifting." Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to send him away before this got ugly. But the truth was, she needed him, not just his labor, his strength, his steady presence that made the loneliness a little less crushing. "All right," she said. "We fight." They shook on it, and Margaret felt the calluses on his palm match her own. Outside, the sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the smoke. And on Wind Hollow Ridge, two people who'd both learned to survive alone began learning what it meant to stand together. The first battle had been fought, but the war was just beginning. The 11th day, Daniel rode into town. He returned with lumber, fence wire, and news. "Talk to some of the other ranchers," he said, unloading the wagon. "They've all had trouble with Caldwell. Small stuff mostly, fence cutting, water access disputes, but it's escalating." "How'd you pay for this?" Margaret demanded, looking at the supplies. Daniel pulled out his wages from the first week. "Invested it. That was your money. And this is my investment." He hefted a bundle of fence posts. "You want to fight Caldwell, you need proper defenses. Can't defend a ranch with rotten fence posts and wire that breaks when you breathe on it." Margaret wanted to argue, but the logic was sound. She helped him unload instead. That afternoon, riders appeared on the southern ridge. 3 of them, silhouetted against the sky, watching. Daniel saw them at the same time Margaret did. His hand didn't move toward his belt, but she noticed he wasn't wearing a gun. "You armed?" she asked. "No." "Why not?" "Because I promised myself when I left Kansas that I was done with guns." His voice was flat. "Done with violence. Sometimes violence finds you whether you're done with it or not." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Then I'll deal with it when it does." The riders watched for another hour, then disappeared over the ridge. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, listening to the wind howl around the house, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. Not hiring Daniel, that still felt right. But dragging him into her fight with Caldwell, that felt dangerous. Around midnight, she heard footsteps on the porch. She grabbed her rifle and crept to the window. Daniel stood outside, leaning against the rail, staring out at the dark land. Margaret set down the rifle and opened the door. "Can't sleep?" she asked. He turned. "Got used to watching horizons. Hard habit to break." She joined him on the porch, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the cold. "You expecting trouble?" "Always." They stood in silence for a while. The stars were brilliant overhead, undiminished by any competing light. "You know," Margaret said quietly, "you don't have to stay. I'd understand if you took Eliza and moved on. This isn't your fight." "You already said that. And you already gave me your answer, but I'm giving you a chance to change it." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "When my wife died, I thought my life was over. Thought the only thing left was making sure Eliza survived. I stopped planning beyond the next town, the next job, the next paycheck." He turned to look at her. "But these last 11 days, I've started thinking about what comes after next. Started thinking maybe there's still something worth building." Margaret's throat tightened. "Don't build it here just because you're tired of running. This land will eat you alive if you're not committed." "I know." He smiled slightly. "That's why I like it." She shook her head, but she was smiling too. "You're crazy." "Probably." They stood together in the cold dark. Two people who'd both learned the hard way that survival wasn't the same as living. But maybe, just maybe, they were learning the difference. The wind howled its warning across Wind Hollow Ridge. And for the first time in months, Margaret Hale didn't face it alone. The 12th morning came with frost so thick it looked like snow. Margaret woke to find Daniel had already been up for hours. Through her bedroom window, she could see him reinforcing the barn doors with the new lumber he'd bought, his breath visible in the frozen air. He worked with methodical precision, every nail driven true, every board measured twice. She dressed quickly and went outside. The cold hit her like a fist. "You'll freeze to death out here," she called. Daniel didn't look up from his work. "I'll freeze faster doing nothing. At least come in for coffee first." "When I'm done." Margaret recognized the stubbornness in his voice. It matched her own. She went back inside and started breakfast, watching through the window as he continued working. By the time bacon was sizzling in the pan, he'd reinforced both barn doors and started on the windows. Eliza emerged from her room, wrapped in a quilt Margaret had given her. The girl had taken to the house completely now, moving through it with the comfortable familiarity of someone who belonged. "Is Papa still working?" she asked, peering outside. "Always," Margaret said. "You eat breakfast. I'll drag him in." She went back out, this time with a cup of coffee. Daniel had moved to the equipment shed, checking the doors and hinges. You're going to work yourself into an early grave, Margaret said, offering him the cup. He took it gratefully, warming his hands. Better than sitting around waiting for them to come back. They might not. Daniel's look said he didn't believe that any more than she did. The way I see it, he said, Caldwell's testing you. That fire was small enough to put out but big enough to scare you. Next time it'll be bigger. Unless what? Unless we make it clear there won't be a next time. Margaret studied him. You sound like a lawman again. Old habits. He took a long drink of coffee. I spent 5 years dealing with men like Caldwell. Rich, powerful, used to getting what they want. They don't stop unless you make them stop. And how do you make a man like Victor Caldwell stop when he owns half the county? Daniel was quiet for a moment, steam rising from his cup into the frozen air. You make him realize it'll cost more than it's worth. Before Margaret could respond, the sound of hoofbeats carried across the yard. Both of them turned to see a lone rider approaching from the east. Margaret's hand instinctively went to her rifle, but Daniel touched her arm. Wait, I know him. The rider was a weathered man in his 60s, sitting a paint horse with easy confidence. He wore a rancher's practical clothes and a battered hat that had seen better decades. That's Jim Harding, Daniel said. Met him in town yesterday. Runs the spread north of here. Harding reined in near the porch and tipped his hat. Morning, Margaret. Daniel. Jim, Margaret acknowledged. Little early for a social call. This isn't social. Harding dismounted, his expression grim. Heard about your fire. News travels fast. It does when Caldwell's men are drinking about it in the saloon. Harding's jaw tightened. They were laughing, Margaret, saying how the widow Hale finally got the message. Daniel's hand curled into a fist, but his voice stayed level. What exactly did they say? That Victor's tired of waiting, that he's going to take that water access one way or another. Harding pulled an envelope from his coat. This came for you yesterday. Federal Land Office. Thought you should see it right away. Margaret took the envelope with cold fingers. Inside was an official-looking document with government seals and dense legal language. She scanned it, her stomach sinking with every line. What is it? Daniel asked. A survey dispute. Margaret's voice was tight. Caldwell's claiming my southern boundary is wrong. Says that creek isn't on my land at all. It's on federal range, and he's filed for the water rights. Can he do that? If the survey's wrong, yes. She looked at Harding. Is it wrong? Hell no. Your husband and I helped establish that boundary line 20 years ago. I was there when the surveyor drove the stakes. But can you prove it? Daniel asked quietly. The question hung in the air. Harding's silence was answer enough. Records can disappear, Margaret said bitterly, especially when you've got money and influence. So we get new records, Daniel said. Request a new survey. That takes months, and money for the surveyor's fee. Margaret crumpled the document in her fist. Money I don't have. Harding shifted his weight. That's why I'm here. Caldwell's been pulling this same land grab across the territory. He did it to the Hendersons last year, disputed their boundary, tied them up in legal fees until they had to sell. He's doing it to the Pritchards now. And if he succeeds with you, I'm next. So what are you proposing? Margaret asked. We band together, pool resources, hire a good surveyor and a better lawyer. Harding looked between them. Alone, we're vulnerable, but if 5 or 6 ranchers stand united, Caldwell can't pick us off one by one. Margaret wanted to believe it could work, but she'd seen too many alliances crumble when real pressure was applied. Who else is in? She asked. Pritchards are committed, so are the McCalls. I'm working on the Dawsons. Harding pulled out a worn ledger. I've been keeping track of expenses. Between us, we can afford a decent surveyor. And Tom McCall's brother is a lawyer in Denver, says he'll take the case for half his usual rate if we're all plaintiffs. Daniel was studying the papers, his lawman's mind clearly working through the logistics. What about protection? Caldwell's not going to sit back while you organize against him. That's where you come in, Harding said. Word is you used to wear a badge, that you know how to handle trouble. I'm not a lawman anymore. Don't need you to be. Just need someone who won't fold when Caldwell's men come around looking to intimidate. Harding met Daniel's eyes. You willing to stand watch while we get our legal ducks in a row? Margaret saw Daniel's jaw tighten, the internal war playing out behind his eyes, The man who'd sworn off violence versus the man who couldn't stand by and watch injustice. "I'll stand watch," he said finally, "but I'm not wearing a gun. Your choice. But Caldwell's men will be. Then I'll deal with that when it comes." Harding nodded and turned to Margaret. "What do you say? You in?" Every instinct she'd developed over 6 months of solitary survival screamed at her to say no, to keep her head down, fight her own battles, not tie her fate to others who might abandon her when things got hard. But she looked at Daniel, standing beside her in the frozen morning, and she thought about what he'd said the night before. Maybe there's still something worth building. "I'm in," she said. "When do we meet?" "Tomorrow night, my place. Bring your land deeds and any records you have." Harding mounted up and rode off, leaving Margaret and Daniel standing in the cold. "You think it'll work?" she asked. "I think it's better than facing Caldwell alone." "But," Daniel looked at her, "but Caldwell's not going to take this lying down. When he realizes what we're doing, he's going to hit back hard." "I know. And people could get hurt." "I know that too." Margaret squared her shoulders. "But I'm done being afraid. Done letting men like Victor Caldwell decide my fate." Something shifted in Daniel's expression, something that looked almost like pride. "All right then," he said. "Let's get ready." They spent the rest of the day fortifying the ranch. Daniel reinforced every vulnerable point: barn doors, shed windows, the main house. He showed Margaret how to set up sight lines, where to position herself if shooting became necessary, how to make the ranch defensible without turning it into a fortress. Eliza watched from the porch, her doll clutched in her arms. Margaret saw the fear in the girl's eyes, and her heart ached. This was no life for a child, preparing for violence, living under threat. But what choice did they have? That evening after supper, Margaret sat with Eliza while Daniel checked the perimeter one more time. "Are bad men coming?" Eliza asked quietly. Margaret chose honesty. "Maybe, but your papa and I won't let them hurt you." "Papa's very strong." "He is." "Are you strong too?" Margaret smiled. "I'm strong enough." Eliza seemed to accept this. She leaned against Margaret's shoulder, and Margaret found herself stroking the girl's hair without thinking about it. When had this happened? When had this child become hers to protect? Daniel returned an hour later, his face tight with cold and tension. "Everything's secure." "You should rest," Margaret said. "You've been up since before dawn." "So have you." "I'm used to it." "So am I." But he sank into a chair by the fire, exhaustion finally catching up to him. Margaret poured whiskey into 2 glasses and handed him one. "For the cold." They drank in silence, the firelight dancing across their faces. Eliza had already fallen asleep on the couch, her small form curled under a blanket. "You ever think about leaving?" Margaret asked quietly. "Just packing up Eliza and riding out? Starting over somewhere without all this trouble?" Daniel stared into his glass. "Every day." "Why don't you?" "Because running's easy, standing's hard." He looked at her. "And I'm tired of taking the easy way." Margaret understood that. She'd been taking the easy way too, hiding on her ranch, avoiding town, keeping everyone at arm's length, not because she was afraid, but because grief was easier to manage alone. "What happened to your wife?" she heard herself ask. Daniel's expression went distant. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "Fever. Came on fast. Took her faster. 3 days from healthy to gone." "I'm sorry." "So am I." He drained his glass. Eliza was 5. Old enough to remember her mother, young enough to forget the details. Sometimes I catch her struggling to recall Sarah's face, and it tears me apart. "You keep her memory alive." "I try. But memory's a poor substitute for presence." He set down the glass. "What about your husband?" "Heart gave out," Margaret said. "He was fixing the windmill, just collapsed. By the time I got to him, he was already gone." "No warning?" "None. He was 58, strong as an ox, or so I thought." She twisted her wedding ring, a habit she couldn't break. "We'd been married 40 years. You'd think that would prepare you. It doesn't." "No," Daniel agreed. "It doesn't." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 people who understood loss in ways most couldn't. Finally, Margaret stood. I'm going to bed. You should too. I will. In a minute. But when she checked an hour later, he was still sitting by the fire, keeping watch. Always watching. The next day was Sunday. Margaret hadn't been to church since Thomas died, couldn't bear the pitying looks, the awkward condolences. But today she had business in town, so she hitched the wagon and prepared to face the congregation. You want company? Daniel asked. Better if you stay here. Keep an eye on things. You sure? I can handle a church service. But as she drove into town, Margaret felt her stomach tighten. The church was full. Ranchers and their families, shopkeepers, the respectable citizens of a town that had watched her struggle for 6 months without offering real help. She took a seat in the back, ignoring the whispers. The sermon was about perseverance, about faith in hard times. The preacher's words washed over her, meaningless platitudes that didn't touch the reality of burning barns and land disputes. After the service, she was cornered by Emma Pritchard, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who ran a spread west of town. Heard you're joining our little alliance, Emma said without preamble. Jim Harding made a good case. He did for us too. Emma lowered her voice. But I need to know, are you committed? Because if Caldwell catches wind of this and you fold, it puts the rest of us at risk. Margaret bristled. I don't fold. Your husband died 6 months ago. You hired a drifter to run your ranch. You're barely holding on. Emma's words were blunt but not unkind. I need to know you won't crack when the pressure comes. I won't. How can you be sure? Margaret thought about Daniel working in the frozen dawn, about Eliza learning to feed chickens, about the way her house felt less empty with voices in it. Because I'm not holding on alone anymore, she said. Emma studied her, then nodded. Good. See you tomorrow night at Harding's. Margaret escaped before anyone else could corner her. She bought supplies at the general store, avoiding eye contact with Robert Caldwell, who she spotted across the street. On the drive home, she felt exposed, vulnerable. Every shadow looked like a rider, every sound like trouble. But when the ranch came into view, she saw Daniel in the yard working on the fence, saw Eliza playing with the barn cats, saw smoke rising from the chimney. Home. She'd forgotten what that felt like. That evening, they prepared for the meeting at Harding's. Daniel insisted on coming along. Someone needs to stay with Eliza, Margaret argued. Bring her. Harding's got kids. She'll be fine. This could get heated, could get dangerous. All the more reason I should be there. Margaret wanted to argue, but the truth was she wanted him there, wanted his steady presence beside her when she walked into a room full of desperate ranchers betting everything on a fragile alliance. They arrived at Harding's ranch just after sunset. 6 other families were already there, the Pritchards, the McCalls, the Dawsons, and 3 others Margaret knew only by reputation. Jim Harding welcomed them into his main house, a sprawling structure built to accommodate large gatherings. The men gathered around a massive table covered in maps and land deeds. The women took the children to another room where food was laid out. Margaret started to follow the women, then stopped. I'm staying here, she announced. The men looked uncomfortable. Emma Pritchard, however, smiled and joined her. This concerns my land as much as any man's, Emma said. I'm staying too. 2 other women followed their lead. The men exchanged glances but said nothing. Harding spread a survey map across the table. All right, let's get started. Caldwell's been filing boundary disputes against Margaret, the Pritchards, and the Hendersons before they sold out. I've mapped the pattern. He pointed to marks on the map. All the disputed boundaries shared one thing, access to year-round water. He's not just grabbing land, Daniel observed. He's consolidating water rights. Exactly, Harding said. Control the water, control the cattle. Control the cattle, control the territory. So what's our strategy? Thomas McCall asked. He was a broad man with a scar across his forehead, his presence commanding attention. Legal challenge first, Harding said. We pool money for a proper survey. If that confirms our boundaries are legitimate, we take it to court. And if the survey's been tampered with, Emma asked, if Caldwell's already paid off the land office, then we go over their heads, Federal Land Commission in Denver. That could take years, someone muttered. Better years than losing everything in months, Harding shot back. Daniel had been studying the map in silence. Now he spoke. What about direct action? Everyone looked at him. What kind of direct action? McCall asked. Caldwell's using intimidation, fires, threats, fence cutting. What if we respond in kind, not violence? He added quickly, seeing their expressions. But presence. We patrol our collective boundaries. We make it clear that anyone who comes onto our land uninvited will face consequences. You're talking about starting a range war, someone said. I'm talking about defending what's ours. Silence fell around the table. Margaret could see the fear and calculation in their faces. These were ranchers, not fighters. They wanted legal solutions, not confrontation. But Margaret understood what Daniel was really saying. Caldwell would keep pushing until someone pushed back. I'm in, she said. My land, my responsibility. I'll patrol my own boundaries. And I'll help her, Daniel added. Emma Pritchard nodded slowly. We'll do the same. One by one, the others agreed. Not eagerly, but with grim determination. They spent the next 2 hours working out details, patrol schedules, signal systems, emergency protocols. By the time they left, they had a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. On the ride home, Eliza fell asleep in the wagon bed, wrapped in blankets. Daniel drove while Margaret sat beside him, watching the stars. You think we can win this? She asked quietly. I think we have to try. That's not an answer. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When I was a deputy, I learned that bullies only respect force. Caldwell's a bully with money and power, but he's still just a bully, and bullies can be beaten if you're willing to pay the price. Margaret thought about that, about what price she was willing to pay. Her ranch, her safety, her life if it came to that. But then she thought about Eliza, sleeping peacefully in the wagon. About Daniel, who'd chosen to stand when running would have been easier. About the alliance they'd just formed, fragile but real. I'm willing, she said. Daniel reached over and took her hand. His palm was warm, calloused, solid. So am I. They rode the rest of the way in silence, their hands clasped in the darkness. When they reached the ranch, Daniel carried Eliza inside while Margaret unhitched the horses. The night was cold and clear, the kind of cold that made everything feel sharp and close. Inside, the fire had burned down to embers. Daniel laid Eliza in her bed, then returned to build up the flames. Margaret poured coffee, and they sat together, not talking, just being. Thank you, she said finally. For what? For staying, for fighting, for making this feel possible. Daniel looked at her, firelight catching in his gray eyes. You made it possible. I'm just following your lead. Liar, but she smiled. You've been leading since you got here. Then we're leading together. Something passed between them, an understanding that went deeper than words. They were partners now. Not just employer and worker, not just allies in a fight. Something more. Margaret felt it settling into her bones, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She was 55 years old. She'd loved and lost. She'd thought that chapter of her life was finished, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe there were still pages left to write. Get some rest, she said, standing. Tomorrow we start patrols. Tomorrow, Daniel agreed. He left for the bunkhouse and Margaret banked the fire. Before going to bed, she checked on Eliza. The girl was sleeping soundly, her small face peaceful. Margaret brushed hair from the child's forehead, her touch gentle. I won't let anything happen to you, she whispered. In her own room, Margaret lay in darkness, thinking about the alliance they'd formed, about the fight ahead, about the man who'd chosen to stand beside her. Outside, the wind howled its eternal warning across Wind Hollow Ridge. But inside, for the first time in months, Margaret felt something stronger than fear. She felt ready. Ready came with the dawn, cold and unforgiving. Margaret woke to find Daniel already saddling horses in the pre-dawn darkness. She dressed quickly, her fingers stiff with cold and something that might have been anticipation or fear. She couldn't tell the difference anymore. Starting patrols today? She asked, joining him in the barn. No point waiting. Caldwell knows about the alliance by now. He'll move fast. How do you know? Daniel tightened the cinch on Margaret's mare. Because that's what I do. Strike before the enemy gets organized. The casual way he said enemy sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the November cold. They rode out together, leaving Eliza with strict instructions to stay inside and keep the doors locked. The girl had nodded solemnly, clutching her doll, and Margaret's heart had twisted at the fear in those dark eyes. The southern boundary stretched for nearly 3 miles, following the creek that Victor Caldwell wanted so desperately. In the pale morning light, Margaret could see why. Even now, in late autumn, the water ran clear and strong. Come winter, when other creeks froze solid, this one would keep flowing. It was worth a fortune in cattle country, worth killing for, if you were the kind of man who measured worth in dollars instead of lives. They rode in silence, checking fence lines and looking for signs of disturbance. Everything seemed quiet. Too quiet, Margaret thought, her hand resting on the rifle across her saddle. There, Daniel said suddenly, pointing. Fresh hoof prints in the soft earth near the creek. Multiple horses, moving parallel to the boundary line. Scouting, Margaret realized. Caldwell's men checking their defenses. How recent? She asked. Daniel dismounted and crouched beside the tracks. Last night. Maybe 4 hours ago. They came while we were at Harding's. Smart. They wanted to see if we'd leave the ranch unprotected during the meeting. Margaret felt anger bloom hot in her chest. They could have heard Eliza. They didn't, though. They were just looking. Daniel stood, his expression grim. But next time they might do more than look. They continued the patrol, finding 2 more sets of tracks before noon. Each one followed the same pattern, staying just outside the boundary, observing, measuring. They're planning something, Margaret said. Yes. When? Soon. Daniel reined his horse around, heading back toward the ranch house. We need to be ready. But ready for what? Margaret had spent 6 months fighting weather and loneliness and grief. She knew how to survive those enemies. She didn't know how to survive men with guns and bad intentions. They returned to find Jim Harding waiting in their yard, his face tight with news that clearly wasn't good. McCall's got hit last night, he said without preamble. Barn burned to the ground, lost 6 horses and most of their winter hay. Margaret felt her stomach drop. Anyone hurt? Thomas's youngest boy went in after the horses, got burned pretty bad. Harding's jaw clenched. Doctor says he'll live, but it was close. Daniel's hands curled into fists. Caldwell? Who else? But there's no proof. The riders wore masks, came in the dark, disappeared before anyone could get a good look. There's never proof with men like Caldwell, Daniel said flatly. That's how they operate, fear and deniability. Margaret thought about young Billy McCall, couldn't be more than 14. Thought about him running into a burning barn, desperate to save the family's horses. Thought about the pain, the fear, the scars he'd carry forever. What are we going to do? She asked. Harding pulled out a flask and took a long drink before answering. Meeting tonight, my place again. We need to decide if we're still committed to this alliance or if we're cutting our losses. Cutting losses means letting Caldwell win, Daniel said. Cutting losses means keeping our children alive. Harding's voice was rough with emotion. Billy McCall damn near died last night. You think his father's going to risk that again for water rights? The question hung heavy between them. Margaret understood it perfectly. How much were you willing to sacrifice? How much blood before the price became too high? We'll be there tonight, she said quietly. After Harding left, Margaret and Daniel stood in the yard, the weight of the situation pressing down on them like physical force. You should take Eliza and leave, Margaret said. This isn't your fight anymore. It's gotten too dangerous. Daniel turned to look at her, and the expression in his gray eyes was harder than she'd ever seen it. You really think I'd run now? After what happened to Billy McCall? I think you'd be smart to protect your daughter. I am protecting my daughter. By showing her that you don't surrender to bullies, that you stand for what's right even when it's hard. He stepped closer. Besides, you really think Caldwell will stop with you? If he wins here, he'll keep pushing. He'll take Harding's land, then the Pritchards, then whoever's next. Running just delays the inevitable. Margaret knew he was right, but knowing it didn't make the fear any easier to carry. That afternoon, while Daniel reinforced the barn with fire-resistant materials he'd bought from town, Margaret sat with Eliza and taught her to load a rifle. I'm scared, Eliza whispered, her small hands trembling on the weapon. "I know, sweetheart. So am I." "But you're brave." Margaret laughed bitterly. "Being brave just means being scared and doing it anyway. Papa says you're the strongest woman he's ever met." Something in Margaret's chest tightened. "Your papa says that?" Eliza nodded seriously. "He says you've lost everything, but you're still fighting. He says that's real strength." Margaret had to look away, blinking against sudden tears. When had this happened? When had she started caring what Daniel Mercer thought of her? When had his opinion started mattering more than her own carefully constructed walls? "Let's hope your papa's right," she said, helping Eliza sight down the barrel. "Because we're going to need all the strength we can get." The meeting that night was smaller than before. Two families had pulled out, the Dawsons and the Hendersons, too frightened by what happened to Billy McCall to continue resisting. Margaret didn't blame them. She understood that kind of fear. The remaining families gathered around Harding's table with the grim determination of soldiers before battle. Thomas McCall was there, his face haggard, his eyes burning with rage. "My son almost died," he said without preamble. "Caldwell did this, we all know it. The question is what we're going to do about it." "Legal channels," Emma Pritchard said, but her voice lacked conviction. "We stick to the plan. Hire the surveyor, file the injunction." "That takes months," McCall interrupted. "Months while Caldwell picks us off one by one. My barn's gone. Who's next? Yours? Harding's? Margaret's?" "So what are you suggesting?" Harding asked quietly. McCall's hand slammed down on the table. "I'm suggesting we stop playing by rules Caldwell ignores. I'm suggesting we hit back." Silence fell heavy as stone. Margaret saw Daniel tense beside her, saw the war playing out behind his eyes. "Hit back how?" someone asked. "Burn one of his barns, cut his fences. Show him we're not going to take this lying down." "That's vigilante justice," Emma said. "That makes us no better than him." "That makes us survivors," McCall shot back. "You think Caldwell cares about justice? About right and wrong? He cares about power, and power only respects force." Daniel stood slowly. Every eye in the room turned to him. "I spent 5 years as a lawman," he said, his voice carrying quiet authority. "I've seen range wars. I've buried men who thought violence was the answer. It never is." "Easy for you to say," McCall spat. "Your kid isn't lying in bed covered in burns." "No, but I lost my wife to circumstances I couldn't control. I know what it's like to want revenge, to want to make someone pay." Daniel's voice remained steady, but Margaret heard the pain underneath. "And I know that revenge doesn't bring back what you've lost. It just creates more loss." "So we do nothing? Just wait for Caldwell to destroy us?" "We do something smart," Daniel said. "We make Caldwell's actions public. We bring in federal marshals. We force this into the light where he can't hide behind hired guns and deniability." McCall laughed bitterly. "The law didn't protect my son." "Because we didn't give it a chance. We've been handling this privately, trying to solve it ourselves. But if we file formal complaints, if we demand federal investigation, Caldwell can't just burn his way out of it." "He can if the law's on his side," someone muttered. "Then we make sure it isn't." Daniel pulled papers from his coat. "I wrote to the territorial marshal in Denver, detailed everything, the fires, the fence cutting, the survey tampering. I sent it 3 days ago." Margaret stared at him. "You what?" "I used to be law. I still have connections. The marshal owes me a favor for my Dodge City days." Daniel spread the papers on the table. "He responded today. He's sending 2 deputies to investigate. They'll be here in a week." The room erupted in conversation. Some people looked relieved. Others, like McCall, looked skeptical. "And what do we do for that week?" McCall demanded. "Just wait and hope Caldwell doesn't burn us out?" "We defend our property. We document everything. We build a case." Daniel's eyes were hard. "And we don't give Caldwell any excuse to paint us as the aggressors. Because if federal marshals arrive and find we've been burning barns and cutting fences too, they'll arrest us right alongside Caldwell's men." Slowly, grudgingly, the others nodded. Even McCall, though his jaw stayed clenched with barely restrained fury. They spent the next hour planning defensive measures, rotating watch schedules, emergency signals using mirror flashes and gunshots, safe houses where families could retreat if attacked. It was after midnight when Margaret and Daniel finally headed home. Eliza had fallen asleep on Harding's couch, and Daniel carried her to the wagon with infinite care. "You should have told me about the marshal," Margaret said as they drove through the darkness. "Would you have approved?" "I don't know. Maybe. Probably." She paused. "Yes. Then I'm sorry I didn't ask first. But I saw which way things were heading. McCall's not the only one thinking about revenge. If I hadn't given them another option, this alliance would have turned into a war party." Margaret knew he was right. She'd seen the anger in those ranchers' eyes, the desperate fury of people pushed too far. "You think the marshals will help?" she asked. "I think they'll investigate honestly. That's all we need. Honesty. Let the facts speak for themselves." "And if the facts aren't enough?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "Then we'll deal with that when it comes." They reached the ranch to find everything undisturbed. Daniel carried Eliza inside while Margaret unhitched the horses. The night was bitter cold, the stars sharp as broken glass overhead. Inside, after Eliza was tucked safely in bed, Margaret poured whiskey for both of them. They sat by the fire, too wired to sleep. "Why didn't you tell me you'd written to the marshal?" she asked again, more gently this time. Daniel stared into the flames. "Because part of me didn't want to drag the law back into my life. I left that behind in Kansas, swore I was done with badges and justice and all the things that failed to protect what mattered. But you did it anyway. Because watching you prepare for war reminded me why I became a lawman in the first place. Not for the badge, for the people who couldn't protect themselves." He looked at her. "You're strong, Margaret. Stronger than anyone I've met. But you shouldn't have to fight this alone." Margaret felt something crack open in her chest, some wall she'd been maintaining since Thomas died. "I'm not alone anymore," she said quietly. "Am I?" "No." The word was simple, final, a promise. Margaret set down her glass and moved to sit beside him, close enough to feel his warmth, to see the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "I'm 55 years old," she said. "I'm widowed. I'm broke. I'm fighting a range war I might not win. I have nothing to offer you except trouble and hard ground." Daniel's hand found hers in the space between them. "I'm 42. I'm widowed. I'm drifting with a 7-year-old daughter and no home to call my own. I have nothing to offer except labor and stubbornness." He squeezed her hand. "Sounds like a fair trade to me." Margaret felt tears burning behind her eyes. When was the last time someone had seen her, really seen her, not as a widow or a rancher or a problem to be solved, but as a woman worth standing beside? "Daniel, you don't have to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I'm not asking for anything. I just want you to know you're not alone." But Margaret needed to say it, needed to speak the truth that had been growing inside her for 3 weeks, since the moment a stranger and his daughter had ridden across her horizon. "I'm falling for you," she said, "and it terrifies me. Because the last time I let myself care this much, I lost everything." Daniel's thumb traced circles on her palm. "I'm terrified too, but I'm more terrified of running away and regretting it for the rest of my life." They sat in the firelight, hands clasped, two people who'd both learned that love and loss were two sides of the same coin, that you couldn't have one without risking the other. "Stay," Margaret whispered, "not just for the fight with Caldwell, after, stay." "I'm not going anywhere," Daniel said. And when he leaned in to kiss her, gentle and careful and full of promise, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not the desperate, fragile hope of survival, but the fierce, stubborn hope of beginning again. They stayed by the fire until it burned down to embers. Then Daniel walked to the bunkhouse through the frozen night, and Margaret went to her bedroom alone. But alone felt different now. Less like isolation and more like anticipation. Tomorrow would bring new dangers. But tonight, she'd found something worth fighting for beyond land and water rights. She'd found a future that didn't end with memories. The next 3 days passed in tense preparation. Daniel fortified every vulnerable point on the ranch. Margaret drilled Eliza on emergency procedures, where to hide, how to signal for help, what to do if separated from the adults. The Alliance ranchers took turns patrolling their collective boundaries. Each night, someone spotted Caldwell's riders watching from the hills, counting their numbers, measuring their resolve. On the fourth day, the first real attack came. Margaret was in town buying supplies when she heard the commotion. Men shouting, horses running. She emerged from the general store to see thick black smoke rising from the direction of the Pritchard ranch. Her heart stopped. She abandoned her supplies and drove the wagon home at dangerous speed. If Caldwell was hitting the Pritchards, her ranch could be next. She arrived to find Daniel on the roof, rifle in hand, scanning the horizon. Eliza was locked in the root cellar as they'd practiced. "Pritchards?" she called up. "Their equipment shed. Got the fire out before it spread, but they lost most of their tools." Daniel climbed down, his face grim. 3 riders. Same pattern as the McCalls, masked, fast, gone before anyone could respond. Where are they hitting next? That's the question. The answer came that night. Margaret woke to the sound of breaking glass. She was out of bed with her rifle before conscious thought caught up. In the main room, she found Daniel already there, weapon raised. The window facing the barn had been shattered. Through it, she could see torches moving in the darkness. "Eliza," she breathed. "Already in the cellar. I got her down when I heard the horses." Daniel's voice was deadly calm. "You take the back door. I'll cover the front. We make them work for it." Margaret positioned herself at the back entrance, heart hammering. Through the broken window, she could see 4 figures spreading out around the barn. One carried a torch toward the hay storage. She fired. The shot cracked through the night, and the torchbearer stumbled. Not hit, but close enough to scare him. The other riders scattered, momentarily confused. Daniel fired from the front, deliberately high, but close enough to send a message. "Next one's not a warning!" he shouted into the darkness. For a moment, everything was still. Margaret could hear her own breathing, could feel sweat running down her back despite the cold. Then a voice called out from the darkness. "You're just delaying the inevitable, Mrs. Hale. Mr. Caldwell's going to get that water one way or another." Margaret recognized the voice. Robert Caldwell, Victor's son, leading his father's dirty work. "Tell your father he can go to hell," she shouted back. Robert laughed. "He already owns half of it. The other half's just a matter of time." Another torch flew through the air, landing on the barn roof. The dry wood caught instantly. Margaret's world narrowed to that spreading flame. Everything she and Thomas had built. Everything she'd been fighting to preserve. "Cover me," Daniel said, and before Margaret could respond, he was out the door and running toward the barn. She fired blindly toward where the riders had been, trying to keep them pinned while Daniel grabbed the ladder and climbed toward the flames. She saw him reach the roof, saw him beating at the fire with his coat. A shot rang out from the darkness. Daniel flinched but kept working. They'd fired at him. Actually fired. Something cold and terrible settled into Margaret's chest. This wasn't intimidation anymore. This was attempted murder. She aimed carefully at the muzzle flash and pulled the trigger. A cry of pain confirmed the hit. "Pull back!" Robert's voice, no longer cocky. "Pull back!" The riders retreated, one of them slumped in his saddle. Margaret watched them disappear into the darkness, then ran to help Daniel. Together, they fought the fire. Bucket after bucket from the water trough, while Margaret's arms screamed and her lungs burned from smoke. It took an hour, but they saved the barn. Barely. When it was over, they stood in the scorched yard, covered in soot and ash, breathing hard. "I hit one of them," Margaret said. "Maybe badly." "Good." "Daniel, they tried to kill us, Margaret. You, me, Eliza sleeping in that cellar. They tried to burn us alive." His voice shook with barely controlled rage. "So, yes, good." Margaret had never heard him like this, had never seen the lawman and the widower and the father merge into something dangerous. "We need to get the marshal here faster," she said. "I'll ride to Denver tomorrow. Deliver the evidence in person if I have to. That's 2 days' ride each way. You can't leave us alone that long." Daniel looked at her, and she saw the fear beneath his anger. Fear for her, for Eliza, for this fragile thing they'd built. "Then we bring in help. Harding, McCall, whoever's willing. We turn this ranch into a fortress until the law arrives." They checked on Eliza, found her crying in the cellar, terrified by the sounds of gunfire and breaking glass. Margaret held her while Daniel secured the broken window with boards. The rest of the night they took turns keeping watch. When dawn finally came, pale and cold, Margaret felt like she'd aged 10 years. Jim Harding arrived with the sun, bringing Thomas McCall and 4 other ranchers. They'd seen the smoke, heard the shots. "This ends now," McCall said, surveying the damage. "We go to Caldwell directly. We make him call off his dogs." "That's what he wants," Daniel argued. "He wants us to come to him angry and armed so he can claim self-defense when he kills us." "Then what do you suggest?" Daniel pulled out papers, the evidence he'd compiled. "I ride to Denver today. I put this directly in the marshal's hands. The rest of you stay here. Protect Margaret and Eliza until I return." "I should go with you," Margaret said. "You should stay where Caldwell can see you're still here, where he knows you haven't run." Daniel's eyes met hers. "Trust me." Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to insist on going, on not being left behind like some helpless woman, but she looked at Eliza exhausted and frightened, and she knew Daniel was right. "2 days," she said. "If you're not back in 2 days, I'll be back," Daniel promised. He left within the hour, riding the big roan hard toward Denver. Margaret watched him disappear over the ridge, fear and faith warring in her chest. The other ranchers stayed, turning the ranch into exactly what Daniel had suggested, a fortress. They set up firing positions, stockpiled ammunition, organized watch rotations, and they waited. That night, Margaret stood on her porch with her rifle, watching the horizon. Somewhere out there, Victor Caldwell was planning his next move, and somewhere beyond that, Daniel was riding through the darkness, carrying their last hope for justice. The wind screamed across Wind Hollow Ridge, carrying the smell of smoke and the promise of more violence to come. Margaret checked her ammunition one more time and settled in for a long night. The war had begun in earnest, and she would be damned if she'd surrender. The first night without Daniel stretched impossibly long. Margaret stood her watch shift from midnight to 3, rifle across her knees, eyes scanning the darkness for movement that never came. The silence was worse than gunfire. It meant Caldwell was planning, waiting, choosing his moment. Jim Harding relieved her at 3, his face haggard in the lantern light. "Get some sleep, Margaret. You're no good to us exhausted." But sleep didn't come. She lay in bed listening to the house settle, to Eliza's soft breathing from the next room, to the wind that never stopped its warning. Somewhere out there, Daniel was riding hard through the night, and every minute that passed felt like a lifetime. She rose before dawn, made coffee strong enough to strip paint, and found Thomas McCall already up, checking the perimeter. "Nothing," he reported. "No movement since midnight." "That worries me more than an attack." McCall nodded grimly. "Me too. Caldwell's not the type to give up after one failed raid." They were right to worry. The attack came at noon when the sun was high and everyone's guard had started to slip. Margaret was in the kitchen making lunch when she heard horses, a lot of them. She grabbed her rifle and ran to the window. 8 riders were coming in fast from the east, not bothering with stealth or darkness this time. Daylight assault, meant to overwhelm through force. "Positions," McCall shouted, and the ranchers scattered to their assigned posts. Margaret took her spot at the front window, Eliza already locked safely in the cellar. Her hands were steady as she raised the rifle, sighting down the barrel at the lead rider. Robert Caldwell, again. But this time he wasn't hiding behind a mask. The riders pulled up 50 yards from the house, just out of easy rifle range. Robert sat his horse with arrogant confidence, a smile playing on his lips. "Mrs. Hale," he called out. "I think it's time we had a conversation." "I've got nothing to say to you," Margaret shouted back. "Then listen. My father's patience is exhausted. He's prepared to make you one final offer for your land. Fair market value plus 20%. Take it, and all this unpleasantness ends." Margaret laughed, harsh and bitter. "Fair market value from the man who's been destroying that value? You burned my barn, terrorized my neighbors, shot at us in the night, and now you want to pay me for the privilege of stealing my land?" "What happened to your barn was unfortunate," Robert said, his voice carrying false sympathy. "But these things happen when people refuse to be reasonable. Take the offer, Margaret, before something worse happens." "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise." Robert's smile disappeared. "You've got until sunset to decide. After that, my father takes what he wants. And trust me, you won't like his methods." "I've already seen his methods. I'm still here. For now." Robert wheeled his horse around. Sunset, Mrs. Hale, think carefully. The riders departed, leaving dust and dread in their wake. McCall joined Margaret at the window. He's serious. Caldwell's done playing games. So am I. But Margaret's voice shook slightly. 8 riders against their 5 defenders. If Caldwell came back with real force, with real intent to kill, they couldn't hold out. Where the hell is Daniel? Someone muttered. Margaret wondered the same thing. Denver was 2 days' hard ride. Even if everything went perfectly, he couldn't be back before tomorrow evening. That left them alone for at least another 30 hours. Could they last that long? Emma Pritchard, who'd arrived that morning with fresh supplies, pulled Margaret aside. You need to consider the offer. You can't be serious. I'm being practical. Your husband's dead, you're barely holding on financially, and now you're facing armed assault. Sometimes retreat is the smart choice. Retreat is surrender, Margaret said flatly. If I take Caldwell's offer, everyone else falls. You know that. He'll use my land to choke off your water access, then he'll come for you next, and the next, until he owns the whole valley. Emma's jaw tightened. Then what do you suggest? We hold, we fight, we wait for the law. And if the law doesn't come in time? Margaret didn't have an answer for that. The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. The defenders took turns eating, resting, watching. Eliza stayed in the cellar where Margaret visited her every hour with food and reassurance she didn't quite feel. When's Papa coming home? Eliza asked, her small face tight with worry. Soon, sweetheart. Very soon. I miss him. Me too. Margaret smoothed the girl's hair, her heart aching. What had she done dragging this child into her war? Eliza should be somewhere safe, somewhere peaceful, not huddled in a root cellar waiting for violence. But there was nowhere safe anymore, not as long as men like Victor Caldwell existed. The sun crept toward the horizon with terrible inevitability. Margaret checked her ammunition for the 10th time. 47 rounds, enough for a short fight, not nearly enough for a siege. McCall gathered everyone in the main room as the light began to fail. If they come in force, we can't win a straight fight. Our only advantage is the house. Solid walls, good firing positions. We make them pay for every foot of ground. What about running? Someone asked. Load the women and children in a wagon and head for town? They'd run us down before we made a mile, McCall said. No, we stand here. We hold until Daniel returns with help. If he returns? Margaret thought, but didn't say. They took their positions as the sun touched the ridge. Margaret at the front window, McCall at the back, Emma and Harding covering the sides. The 5th defender, a young ranch hand named Pete, climbed into the loft with extra ammunition. The light bled out of the sky, turning everything amber and then red. And then the riders came. Not 8 this time. 15, 20. Margaret stopped counting at 25. They came from all directions at once, surrounding the house in a loose circle just beyond rifle range. Sweet Jesus, Harding breathed. That's half of Caldwell's crew. Robert Caldwell rode forward alone, stopping in the same spot as before. Your time's up, Mrs. Hale. Last chance to take the offer. Margaret's answer was to raise her rifle and fire. The shot kicked up dust 6 inches from Robert's horse. Not a miss. A message. Robert's face went dark with rage. You stupid woman! You're going to get everyone in that house killed. Then you'll have to explain 25 dead bodies to the territorial marshal, Margaret shouted back. Think Victor wants that kind of attention? The marshal won't get here for days, plenty of time to bury the evidence. He signaled to his men. They began to advance, slowly, testing the defenses. Margaret fired again, this time aiming to wound. A rider yelped and fell from his saddle, clutching his shoulder. The others scattered, taking cover behind whatever they could find. Hold your fire unless they charge, McCall ordered. Make every shot count. The siege had begun. For 2 hours they traded occasional shots. Caldwell's men would advance, the defenders would drive them back. Nobody wanted to be the first to commit to full assault, but Margaret knew it was just a matter of time. Caldwell had the numbers. Eventually he'd rush them all at once, and no amount of accurate shooting would stop 25 determined men. Full darkness fell. The riders lit torches, turning the night into a ring of fire around the house. They're going to try to burn us out, Harding said quietly. Let them try, Margaret replied, but her mouth was dry with fear. The first torch came flying through the darkness, landing on the porch. Margaret shot the next man who tried to throw one, but there were too many. Soon the porch was burning, flames licking at the walls. We need to put that out or we'll lose the house, McCall said. Go out there and you're dead, Margaret replied. Stay in here and we burn. They were trapped, exactly what Caldwell wanted. Then, through the smoke and chaos, Margaret heard something, a sound that didn't belong to the battle. Hoofbeats, coming fast from the south. More of Caldwell's men, she thought desperately. We're finished. But Robert Caldwell's shout of alarm told a different story. Fall back! Fall back! The riders surrounding the house suddenly scattered, retreating toward the hills. Through the smoke, Margaret saw why. A line of riders was charging toward them, and even in the darkness she could see the glint of federal badges. The marshals. And riding at their front, pushing his exhausted horse to its limit, was Daniel. He'd come back, and he'd brought the law. The next few minutes were chaos. The marshals surrounded Caldwell's fleeing men, ordering them to drop their weapons. Some complied. Others tried to run and were quickly overtaken. Margaret burst out of the house, heedless of the danger, and ran to where Daniel was dismounting. He caught her in his arms, both of them filthy and exhausted and alive. You came back, she gasped. I promised, didn't I? He held her tight, his heart hammering against hers. Did they hurt you? We're fine. All of us. She pulled back to look at his face, streaked with trail dust and exhaustion. How did you get them here so fast? Rode all night, didn't stop. Marshal Hackett owed me more than one favor. I called them all in. Daniel glanced toward where the marshals were rounding up Caldwell's men. Is Robert here? He led the attack. Daniel's expression went cold and hard. He walked over to where a marshal had Robert Caldwell in custody, hands bound. You're making a mistake, Robert was saying. We were just protecting our property rights. These squatters have been grazing on my father's land. Save it for the judge, Marshal Hackett interrupted. He was a lean man in his 50s with steel gray hair and eyes that had seen every lie ever told. I've got sworn statements from 6 ranchers documenting arson, assault, and attempted murder. You're going to jail, son. The only question is, for how long? Robert's face twisted with rage. You have no idea who you're dealing with. My father will have your badge. Your father can try. Hackett nodded to his deputies. Take him in and send a detail to the Caldwell Ranch. I want Victor Caldwell in custody by morning. As they dragged Robert away, still protesting, the defenders emerged from the house. Eliza came running from the cellar and threw herself into Daniel's arms. Papa, you came back! Of course I did, sweetheart. He lifted her up, holding her tight. I'll always come back. Margaret watched them together, father and daughter, and felt something in her chest settle into place. This was her family now. However it had happened, however unlikely, these two people belonged to her and she to them. Hackett approached, tipping his hat. Mrs. Hale. Hell of a night. Marshal, thank you for coming. Thank Daniel. He rode into my office like the devil himself was chasing him, slapped down enough evidence to hang Victor Caldwell twice over. Hackett pulled out a notebook. I'll need full statements from everyone. But first, let's get that fire out before you lose your porch. They spent the next hour putting out the flames and giving statements to the deputies. By the time they finished, it was well past midnight, and Margaret was swaying on her feet from exhaustion. You folks should get some rest, Hackett said. We'll have deputies posted around your property tonight. Nobody's going to bother you. The other ranchers headed home, their faces showing cautious relief. McCall gripped Margaret's hand before he left. You did it. You actually beat him. We did it, Margaret corrected. All of us. After everyone had gone, Margaret, Daniel, and Eliza sat in the main room, too wired to sleep despite their exhaustion. The house smelled like smoke and fear, but they were alive. What happens now? Margaret asked. Trials, testimony, justice if we're lucky. Daniel rubbed his face. Caldwell's going down, Margaret. The evidence is overwhelming. Arson, assault, conspiracy, attempted murder. He'll spend years in prison. And his land holdings? That's for the courts to decide. But with him in jail, his empire will crumble. The other ranchers he's been squeezing will finally get free. Margaret leaned back, letting the reality sink in. They'd won. Against all odds, against superior numbers and resources, they'd actually won. "I can't believe it's over," she said quietly. Daniel reached for her hand. "It's not over. It's just beginning." She looked at him, this man who'd ridden into her life 3 weeks ago and changed everything. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we've got a ranch to rebuild, fences to mend, barns to repair, a life to build." His thumb traced circles on her palm. "If you'll have me." Margaret felt tears burn behind her eyes. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" "I'm asking if you'll let me stay, permanently, not as hired help, but as a partner, in the ranch, in raising Eliza, in whatever comes next." "Daniel, I know it's fast, I know we barely know each other, but I also know I've never felt more at home than I do here, with you." His voice roughened with emotion. "I'm done drifting, Margaret, done running. If you'll have me, this is where I want to build my life." Margaret thought about Thomas, about the 40 years they'd shared. She'd loved him deeply, completely, and she'd thought that kind of love came once in a lifetime. But looking at Daniel now, seeing the hope and fear and fierce determination in his eyes, she realized love didn't follow rules. It came when it wanted, in whatever form it chose, and she was done fighting it. "Yes," she said simply. "Stay." Daniel's smile transformed his face. He leaned in and kissed her, gentle and sure, and Margaret felt the last of her walls come down. When they pulled apart, Eliza was watching them with wide eyes. "Does this mean we're a family?" she asked. Margaret opened her arms and the girl climbed into her lap. "Yes, sweetheart, we're a family." They sat together in the smoke-damaged house on Wind Hollow Ridge, 3 people who'd all lost everything and found each other in the ruins. Outside, dawn was breaking. The marshals were camped in the yard, keeping watch. Somewhere in town, Victor Caldwell was being dragged from his mansion in chains. The war was ending. But for Margaret, something else was beginning. She looked at the man beside her, the child in her lap, and she felt something she hadn't felt since Thomas died. Future. Not just survival, not just holding on, but actual future, full of possibility and promise and the terrifying joy of beginning again. "We should get some sleep," Daniel said. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." "Tomorrow and every day after," Margaret agreed. But she was smiling. The next week passed in a blur of legal proceedings and cleanup. Marshal Hackett's investigation uncovered evidence of corruption reaching all the way to the Territorial Land Office. 2 officials were arrested for taking bribes from Caldwell. The fraudulent boundary surveys were thrown out. And Victor Caldwell himself was charged with 23 counts of various crimes. His trial was set for spring. But everyone knew the outcome. The evidence was overwhelming. The Ranchers' Alliance held strong through it all, their unity now forged in fire and proven in battle. They worked together to repair the damage Caldwell had caused, sharing labor and resources. Margaret's barn got a new roof, courtesy of Jim Harding and Thomas McCall. The fence lines were repaired properly, with good posts and strong wire. The ranch began to look like something more than just survival. And through it all, Daniel was there. Working dawn to dusk, teaching Eliza to ride, sitting with Margaret on the porch in the evenings as they planned next season's cattle drive. He moved his belongings from the bunkhouse to the main house 3 weeks after the siege. No formal announcement, no ceremony, just his clothes hanging beside hers in the closet, his boots by the door next to hers. It felt right, natural, like he'd always been there. One evening in mid-December, with the first real snow falling soft and thick, Margaret stood at her window watching Daniel teach Eliza to make snow angels in the yard. The girl's laughter carried clear and bright through the cold air. Thomas McCall's wife had stopped by earlier with a question Margaret had been expecting. "When's the wedding?" she'd asked with a knowing smile. Margaret had hedged, not because she didn't want to marry Daniel, but because the whole town was watching, judging, a widow remarrying so soon after her husband's death. But watching Daniel now, seeing how patient he was with Eliza, how gentle, how completely himself, Margaret realized she didn't care what the town thought. She'd spent 6 months in grief's shadow. She'd earned the right to step back into the light. That night, after Eliza was asleep, Margaret and Daniel sat by the fire with whiskey and quiet. "People are talking," Margaret said. Let them. They think it's too soon, that I'm disrespecting Thomas's memory. Daniel set down his glass and turned to face her fully. What do you think? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, searching for the truth. I think Thomas would want me to be happy. I think he'd approve of you, and I think I'm done letting other people's opinions run my life. So what are you saying? I'm saying marry me, Daniel Mercer. Make it official. Make this family real. Daniel's smile was slow and warm and full of promise. Yes, God, yes. They married on Christmas Eve in a simple ceremony at the ranch, surrounded by the Alliance families who'd become more than neighbors. Eliza stood between them during the vows, holding both their hands, her face glowing with happiness. Marshall Hackett gave the bride away. Emma Pritchard baked the cake. Jim Harding played fiddle while the guests danced in the barn that had been saved from burning. It wasn't a fancy wedding, but it was real. It was theirs. That night, after the guests had gone home and Eliza was finally asleep, exhausted from dancing and cake, Margaret and Daniel stood on their porch watching the stars. Mrs. Mercer, Daniel said, testing out the name. I'm keeping Hale, Margaret replied, but I like the sound of you saying it. He laughed and pulled her close. Fair enough. Mrs. Margaret Hale Mercer. That's too many names. Then just Margaret, my Margaret. She leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. I never thought I'd have this again. A partner, a family, hope. Neither did I. Daniel kissed the top of her head. But here we are. Here they were indeed, on land that had tested every soul who dared to claim it, land that had taken everything and demanded more. But they'd held, they'd fought, they'd won, and in winning, they'd found something neither had been looking for but both desperately needed. Not rescue, not charity. A second beginning. The wind still howled its warning across Wind Hollow Ridge. It always would. This was hard country, and it didn't forgive weakness. But Margaret Hale Mercer, wasn't weak. And neither was the man beside her. Together, they were strong enough for whatever came next. The ranch was theirs. The land was theirs. The future was theirs. And they would build it, brick by brick, fence post by fence post, into something that would last, something worth fighting for, something worth living for. Winter came hard to Wind Hollow Ridge, as it always did. The snow fell thick and steady through January, piling up against the barn walls and turning the landscape into something stark and beautiful. Margaret woke each morning to find Daniel already up, breaking ice on the water troughs, feeding the cattle, keeping the ranch running through the brutal cold. She'd watch him from the kitchen window while coffee brewed, this man who'd become her husband, and marvel at how completely her life had transformed. 6 months ago, she'd been alone, grieving, certain her story was ending. Now she had a partner, a daughter, a future that stretched beyond mere survival. Eliza thrived in the cold. She'd bundle up in layers of wool and run outside to help Daniel, her laughter bright against the white landscape. The girl had grown taller, stronger, more confident. She no longer flinched at sudden sounds or asked when they'd be moving on to the next town. This was home. Finally, permanently home. The trial of Victor Caldwell was scheduled for March, and as winter dragged on, the entire territory waited with bated breath. Marshall Hackett visited twice to go over testimony, ensuring their statements were airtight. Caldwell's hired the best lawyer money can buy, he warned during his second visit. A man named Jameson from San Francisco. He's going to try to make you all look like the aggressors. Let him try, Daniel said quietly. The evidence speaks for itself. Evidence can be twisted. Witnesses can be discredited. Hackett looked at Margaret. They're going to dig into your past, into Thomas's death, into everything. They'll try to paint you as an unstable widow who manipulated these good men into a range war. Margaret felt anger flash hot in her chest. That's a lie. Doesn't matter if it's a lie. Matters if a jury believes it. Hackett pulled out his notebook. So we need to be prepared. Every detail of every attack documented. Every witness credible and consistent. No gaps they can exploit. They spent hours going over the timeline, the first fire, the fence cutting, the night of the siege. Daniel's law enforcement background proved invaluable. He remembered details Margaret had forgotten, corroborated dates with other ranchers, Built a case so solid even a San Francisco lawyer would struggle to crack it. But Margaret couldn't shake the worry. Men like Victor Caldwell didn't go down easily. They had money, influence, connections. They could buy judges, intimidate witnesses, twist the narrative until black looked white. "What if he walks?" she asked Daniel one night as they lay in bed, the wind howling outside. "He won't." "But what if he does? What if the jury decides we're just a bunch of squatters trying to steal his land?" Daniel rolled to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight filtering through the window. "Then we deal with it. But Margaret, I've seen the evidence. I've read the statements. There's no way an honest jury acquits him. And if the jury isn't honest?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then we've learned that the law isn't enough. And we decide what comes next." The words should have frightened her, but instead she felt reassured. Whatever happened, they'd face it together. February brought a thaw, turning the snow to mud and making travel possible again. Emma Pritchard rode over one afternoon with news that Victor Caldwell's lawyer had filed motions to dismiss the case, claiming the territorial court lacked jurisdiction. "It's a delaying tactic," Emma explained, her face tight with frustration. "Jameson's trying to push the trial back, hoping witnesses forget details or change their minds." "Will it work?" Margaret asked. "Not if Judge Harrison has any spine. But Caldwell's been spreading money around town. People are saying things, questioning whether this whole alliance was really defensive or if we were trying to run him off his land." Daniel set down the bridle he'd been oiling. "What people?" "Shopkeepers, bankers, anyone who did business with Caldwell and fears his retribution." Emma shook her head. "He's poisoning the well, making sure we don't have public support when the trial starts." Margaret thought about going into town, facing those whispers and suspicious looks. Part of her wanted to fight back, to defend their actions publicly. But Daniel's hand on her shoulder stopped her. "Don't," he said quietly. "That's what he wants. He wants us angry and reactive, making mistakes he can use against us. So we just let him spread lies? We let our testimony speak for itself. The truth will come out in court." Margaret wanted to believe him, but she'd lived long enough to know that truth didn't always win. Sometimes lies were louder, more convenient, easier to believe. The motion to dismiss was denied in mid-February, and the trial date was set firmly for March 15th. The Alliance ranchers gathered at Margaret's house the night the news arrived, their faces showing a mixture of relief and dread. 6 weeks, Jim Harding said, staring into his whiskey glass. 6 weeks until we find out if we bet everything on the right horse. "We didn't have a choice," Thomas McCall reminded him. "Caldwell was destroying us one by one. At least this way we fight together." "And hang together if we lose," someone muttered. Margaret stood and faced them all. "We're not going to lose. Not because the law is perfect or justice is guaranteed, but because we're telling the truth. We defended our land, our families, our lives. That's not a crime, that's survival." Daniel moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "Margaret's right. We've done nothing wrong. Whatever happens in that courtroom, we walk out with our heads high." The ranchers nodded, their resolve strengthening. They'd come too far to give up now. As winter grudgingly released its grip and the first hints of spring appeared on the ridge, preparations intensified. Witnesses rehearsed their testimony. Documents were organized and copied. The Alliance hired a Denver lawyer named Samuel Chen, who specialized in land disputes and had a reputation for destroying corrupt tycoons. Margaret met Chen in early March when he traveled to Wind Hollow Ridge to interview her. He was younger than she expected, maybe 35, with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind. "Mrs. Hale," he said, studying her across the kitchen table. "Or is it Mrs. Mercer now?" "Hale. I kept my first husband's name." "Good. The jury will respond better to Widow Hale than to a woman who remarried quickly." He saw her expression and added, "I'm not judging. I'm thinking strategically. Jameson will use every detail to undermine you. We need to control the narrative." Chen spent 3 days on the ranch, interviewing everyone, examining the burned barn, photographing the bullet holes in the walls. He was thorough, methodical, and surprisingly kind. "You've got a strong case," he told Margaret on his last evening. "The physical evidence alone is damning. Add in the witness testimony, and Caldwell's done." "You sound confident." "I am, but confidence isn't complacency." Chen packed his papers carefully. Jameson's good. He'll try to make this about property rights, about defending legitimate business interests. He'll paint Caldwell as the victim of aggressive squatters. Our job is to show the jury who really suffered. How? By putting Billy McCall on the stand, by showing his burns, his scars, by making it real. Chen met her eyes. Are you prepared to do that? To put a 14-year-old boy through testimony? Margaret thought about Billy, who still couldn't use his left hand properly, who woke screaming from nightmares about fire. If it puts Caldwell away, yes. Good. Because that's what it's going to take. The trial began on a cold, clear morning in mid-March. The territorial courthouse in Silver Creek was packed with spectators, ranchers, townspeople, and reporters from as far away as Denver. This wasn't just a local matter anymore. It had become a symbol. Small ranchers fighting back against land barons, David versus Goliath in the American West. Margaret sat in the front row between Daniel and Emma Pritchard, her hands clasped tight in her lap. Victor Caldwell sat at the defense table, looking every inch the successful businessman in his tailored suit and polished boots. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked like prosperity incarnate. Judge Harrison entered, a stern man in his 60s with a reputation for fairness. This court is now in session. The Territory versus Victor Caldwell, charged with arson, assault, conspiracy to commit murder, and fraud. The words hung heavy in the air. If convicted on all counts, Caldwell faced 20 years in prison. Jameson opened for the defense, and he was everything Chen had warned about. Smooth, persuasive, reasonable. He painted Caldwell as a legitimate businessman trying to protect his water rights from encroaching squatters. He talked about property law, about survey disputes, about the unfortunate escalation that occurred when reasonable negotiation failed. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Jameson concluded, this is not a case about villainy. It's about complexity, about competing claims and passionate people who let their passions overcome their judgment. My client may have made mistakes, but mistakes are not crimes. Then Chen stood for the prosecution, and the temperature in the courtroom changed. The defense would have you believe this is complicated, he said quietly. It's not. This is about a powerful man who wanted something that didn't belong to him. And when the rightful owners refused to sell, he tried to take it by force. Chen methodically laid out the evidence. Photographs of burned barns, medical testimony about Billy McCall's injuries, financial records showing Caldwell had systematically bankrupted competitors before seizing their land, witness after witness taking the stand to describe intimidation, threats, violence. Margaret testified on the second day. Jameson tried to rattle her, asking pointed questions about her financial troubles, about hiring Daniel so quickly after Thomas's death, about whether desperation had clouded her judgment. Mrs. Hale, he said with false sympathy, isn't it true that you were facing foreclosure when Mr. Caldwell made his offer? I was struggling financially, Margaret admitted. My husband had just died, but I was not facing foreclosure. But you hired a complete stranger to run your ranch, a drifter with a child. Doesn't that suggest desperation? It suggests I recognized competent help when I saw it. Or it suggests you were vulnerable, emotional, making poor decisions. Chen objected, and the judge sustained it. But the implication hung in the air. Unstable widow, bad judgment, brought this on herself. Daniel testified on the third day, and he was unshakable. His law enforcement background gave him credibility. His detailed recollection of every attack, every threat, every piece of evidence left Jameson struggling to find openings. You're a drifter, Mr. Mercer, Jameson said. You've held a dozen jobs in as many towns. Why should this jury believe you're a credible witness? Because I'm telling the truth, Daniel said simply. And because I have nothing to gain by lying. I didn't know these people when I arrived. I had no stake in their land disputes. I'm testifying because I saw crimes committed, and as a former lawman, I have a duty to report them. A former lawman who gave up his badge. Why was that? Personal reasons. Because you couldn't handle the pressure. Because you failed in your duty. Daniel's expression didn't change. Because I lost my wife and needed to focus on raising my daughter. But I never forgot my training or my obligation to justice. The testimony Chen had warned about came on the fourth day. Billy McCall took the stand, his scarred left hand visible to everyone. His mother wept silently in the gallery as he described running into the burning barn, trying to save the horses, feeling his skin catch fire. "Why did you go in?" Chen asked gently. "Because those horses were my family's livelihood. Without them, we'd lose everything." Billy's voice cracked. "I thought I could save them." "And did you?" "3. I saved 3 out of 6. "And what did it cost you?" Billy held up his ruined hand. "My left hand doesn't work right anymore. I can't grip things. Can't do ranch work like I used to." His eyes found Caldwell across the courtroom. "That man took my future, because we wouldn't sell him our water." The silence that followed was absolute. Jameson tried to undermine the testimony, suggesting Billy had been careless, that the fire could have been accidental. But the jury saw through it. You could see it in their faces: horror, sympathy, anger. The prosecution rested on the 5th day. Jameson put up a defense, but it was thin. Character witnesses who swore Caldwell was a pillar of the community. Expert testimony claiming the boundary surveys were legitimate. Robert Caldwell taking the stand to insist they'd only been defending their property rights. But Chen tore it apart on cross-examination. He showed financial records proving Caldwell had bribed the surveyors. He produced a former employee willing to testify that Robert had explicitly ordered the barn burnings. He destroyed every alibi, every excuse, every deflection. By the 6th day, when closing arguments began, the outcome felt inevitable. Victor Caldwell is a land baron who believed his wealth placed him above the law, Chen told the jury. He terrorized honest ranchers, burned their property, injured their children, and attempted murder when they refused to surrender. This is not complexity, this is criminality, and it demands justice. Jameson gave it one last try, appealing to the jury's sympathy for a successful businessman being torn down by jealous competitors. But his heart wasn't in it. Even he could see which way the wind was blowing. Judge Harrison sent the jury out at 4 in the afternoon. They returned at 8 that evening. "On the charge of arson, how do you find?" "Guilty." "On the charge of assault?" "Guilty." "On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder?" "Guilty." With each verdict, Margaret felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Beside her, Daniel's hand found hers and squeezed tight. In the gallery, the Alliance ranchers sat in stunned silence, not quite believing it was real. Victor Caldwell sat motionless as the verdicts were read, his face carved from stone. Only his hands betrayed him, clenched white-knuckled on the table. Judge Harrison announced sentencing would be held in 2 weeks, then dismissed the court. The moment the gavel fell, the courtroom erupted in conversation. Margaret stood on shaking legs, barely able to process what had happened. They'd won. After months of fear and fighting, after burned barns and night raids and desperate last stands, they'd actually won. Chen shook her hand, professional satisfaction on his face. "Justice served, Mrs. Hale." "Thank you," she managed, "for everything. Thank your courage and your testimony. That's what won this case." Outside the courthouse, the Alliance ranchers gathered in a circle, their faces showing relief so profound it bordered on tears. Jim Harding pulled Margaret into a rough embrace. "We did it," he said hoarsely. "We actually did it." "We did," she agreed. Thomas McCall stood with his arm around Billy's shoulders, both of them crying openly. Emma Pritchard was laughing and crying at the same time. The other ranchers were shaking hands, clapping backs, releasing months of tension in one collective exhale. Daniel pulled Margaret aside, away from the celebration. "How do you feel?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Relieved, exhausted, like I can finally breathe." "We can go home now," he said. "Really home. No more looking over our shoulders." Margaret leaned into him, letting his strength support her. "I never thought we'd get here." "But we did. Together." They stayed in town that night, too drained to make the ride back to the ranch. The hotel gave them a room overlooking the main street, and they lay in bed watching Silver Creek celebrate below. "What happens to Caldwell's land?" Margaret asked. "Seized by the territory, most likely. Sold off to pay restitution." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "There's going to be a lot of opportunity for ranchers willing to expand. Are you thinking about it?" "Maybe, if we can afford it. Your southern pasture could use another 100 acres. Margaret smiled in the darkness. Listening to him talk about the future, their future, felt surreal after so many months of just trying to survive the present. "We'll see what spring brings," she said. Spring brought new life to Wind Hollow Ridge. The sentencing hearing in April gave Victor Caldwell 15 years in prison. His son Robert received 10. Their land holdings were indeed seized and auctioned off, with preference given to neighboring ranchers who'd suffered from their actions. Margaret and Daniel bought 50 acres along the creek, expanding their grazing land and securing their water rights permanently. Jim Harding bought another parcel. The Pritchards and McCalls each claimed pieces. Within 2 months, Caldwell's empire had been completely dismantled and redistributed among the people he'd tried to destroy. The ranch prospered through summer. The cattle herd grew. The fences held strong. Daniel hired 2 ranch hands to help with the heavy work, freeing up time for other projects, including the new room they were adding to the house. Eliza, now 8, helped Daniel measure and cut timber while Margaret supervised from the porch, her hand resting on her swelling belly. The baby was due in October, an unexpected blessing that had Margaret both terrified and overjoyed in equal measure. She was 56 years old, pregnant for the first time, defying every expectation she'd ever had for her life. "You sure about this?" Emma Pritchard had asked when Margaret shared the news. "Terrified," Margaret admitted. "But yes, sure." Daniel had reacted with stunned joy, then fierce protectiveness. He'd wanted her to stop working immediately, to rest and take it easy. She'd laughed and reminded him she'd been running this ranch alone 6 months ago. "I'm pregnant, not dying," she'd said. But she let him fuss. Let him help with the heavy lifting, the long rides, the work that used to be hers alone. It felt good, sharing the burden, being partners in every sense. By August, the new room was finished, a nursery painted yellow, with a crib Daniel had built by hand, and curtains Emma had sewn. Eliza had claimed the role of big sister with serious dedication, reading books about babies and practicing with her doll. "I'm going to teach her everything," Eliza announced one evening at dinner. "How to feed chickens and ride horses and be brave." "Her?" Daniel asked with amusement. "It's a girl. I know it." Margaret and Daniel exchanged glances, both smiling. They didn't know the baby's sex, and it didn't matter. Boy or girl, this child would be born into a home filled with love and stability and hope. The baby came early, on a crisp September morning when the aspens were just starting to turn gold. Margaret woke to contractions at dawn and knew immediately what was happening. Daniel rode for the doctor while Emma stayed with her, coaching her through the pain with the calm authority of someone who'd birthed 6 children herself. The labor was hard. Margaret was older, her body not built for this kind of work anymore. But she'd faced down range wars and land barons and the brutal isolation of widowhood. She could handle childbirth. Daniel returned with the doctor just after noon. The baby arrived as the sun was setting, filling the house with cries that were the most beautiful sound Margaret had ever heard. A girl. Eliza had been right. They named her Sarah, after Daniel's first wife, and Hope for what she represented. Sarah Hope Mercer came into the world with a full head of dark hair and her father's gray eyes, and she was perfect. Daniel held her with infinite gentleness, tears streaming down his face. "She's beautiful." "She's ours," Margaret said, exhausted and exhilarated. "Our second beginning." Eliza climbed onto the bed carefully, peering at her new sister with wonder. "Can I hold her?" "Of course." Daniel helped position the baby in Eliza's arms, supporting them both. Margaret watched her family, Daniel, Eliza, baby Sarah, and felt her heart so full it might burst. This moment, this perfect impossible moment, was worth every hardship that had led to it. The months that followed were exhausting and beautiful and chaotic. Sarah was a demanding baby, waking every few hours to feed, but Margaret had help now. Daniel took night shifts. Eliza helped during the day. Emma and the other ranch wives stopped by with food and advice. It took a village, Margaret learned, and she had one. By the time Sarah was 6 months old, crawling and babbling and terrorizing the barn cats, Margaret had fully settled into this new version of her life. She was a rancher, a wife, a mother of 2. She was 57 years old and more alive than she'd been in decades. One evening in early spring, as she sat on the porch watching Daniel teach Eliza to rope fence posts while Sarah napped in her arms, Jim Harding rode up with news. "Thought you'd want to know," he said, dismounting. "Victor Caldwell died in prison last week. Heart attack." Margaret absorbed this information without emotion. She'd stopped thinking about Caldwell months ago, stopped giving him space in her thoughts. "How do you feel about it?" Harding asked. "I don't," Margaret said honestly. "He's past. We're future." Harding nodded slowly, understanding. "The Alliance is talking about making this permanent. Official organization, elected leadership, mutual aid agreements. Wanted to know if you and Daniel would be interested." "In what?" "Being officers. You've got respect in the valley now. People listen to you." Margaret looked at Daniel, who'd heard the conversation and was walking over. "What do you think?" "I think we've built something worth protecting, worth organizing." Daniel sat beside her on the porch step. "I'm in if you are." Margaret thought about the alliance that had saved them, about the community that had formed in the crucible of conflict, about building something lasting for Eliza, for Sarah, for all the children who'd inherit this hard, beautiful land. "We're in," she said. The Wind Hollow Valley Ranchers Alliance was formally established that summer, with Jim Harding as chairman, Margaret as treasurer, and Daniel as marshal, a position he accepted reluctantly but filled with quiet competence. The alliance grew stronger each year, adding new members, pooling resources, creating a network of support that made survival easier for everyone. Margaret's ranch became a gathering place, the site of annual meetings and celebrations. The house that had been so empty and haunted was now filled constantly with voices, laughter, life. Time passed the way it does on the land, measured in seasons rather than days. Eliza grew into a confident young woman who could rope a steer and negotiate cattle prices with equal skill. Sarah grew wild and fearless, climbing everything and fearing nothing. Daniel's hair turned gray at the temples. Margaret's silver hair went completely white. But they grew old together, side by side, partners in every sense. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Margaret stood on the ridge overlooking the ranch, 300 acres grown to 500, the herd numbering over 200 head, the barns and fences all strong and true. Daniel joined her, moving a bit stiffer than he used to, but still solid, still present. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how wrong I was," Margaret said. 10 years ago I thought my life was ending, thought I was just holding on until I could join Thomas. And now? Now I know life doesn't end just because you think it should. It keeps going. It changes. It offers second chances if you're brave enough to take them." Daniel pulled her close. "You've always been brave. So have you." They stood together as the sun set over Wind Hollow Ridge, painting the land in gold and shadow. Below them, smoke rose from the chimney of their house. In the yard, Eliza was teaching Sarah to feed the chickens, just as she'd promised all those years ago. The wind still howled its warning across the ridge, but it no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like home. Margaret Hale Mercer, was 67 years old. She'd been widowed, remarried, become a mother again, survived a range war, and built an empire from hard ground and harder choices. She'd learned that strength didn't vanish with age, that love didn't follow rules or schedules, that second chances came when you least expected them, in forms you never imagined. And she'd learned that the best beginnings often rose from the ashes of terrible endings. The land had tested her, pushed her to her limits and beyond, but she'd held. She'd fought. She'd won. Not because she was lucky, not because it was easy, but because she'd been strong enough to stand, wise enough to accept help, and brave enough to build something new from the ruins of everything she'd lost. On Wind Hollow Ridge, where the wind warned and the land demanded, and survival was never guaranteed, Margaret had found more than survival. She'd found life, real, messy, beautiful life, and she was living it fully, completely, gratefully, every single day.